So it's my pleasure to welcome Richard, who's going to talk to us about Boles Barrow, the famous barrow on Salisbury Plain, perhaps best known for being the home, or perhaps not the home, of the lump of bluestone that's currently in Salisbury Museum. But I know, Richard, you're going to be telling us a bit more about that. So thank you so much for doing this talk, and over to you.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think Boles Barrow is probably one of the two sites that's intrigued me most about the military area of Salisbury Plain since I've been there, and that's 20 years now, actually. Um, it's because it has so many enigmatic elements to it. It's in many ways a microcosm of Wiltshire archaeology. There are so many elements in the museums of the county, certainly in Devizes, that are connected to this monument. And every time I drive past it, I think there is so much more we could find out about it. From an archaeology curator's point of view, which is why I'm employed by the MOD, it was certainly one of those one of those monuments that was included in the very first historic heritage at risk list of English heritage, or historic England as it is now. And so I've had to do quite a bit of curatorial input onto this site. I think with all these talks, you should get a beginning, a middle, and an end. But maybe at this time, you're not going to get an end at this point, because I don't think, there's a spoiler, I don't think we're going to answer too many of the mysteries. And there's certainly a lot more that could be done. And David mentioned the famous Boles Barrow bluestone. And here's an image of it on the left of its recent display at the rather wonderful Stonehenge exhibition that took place last year at the British Museum. So when you think about it, they're doing the Age of Stonehenge at the National Museum. It's an international exhibition, and one of the items in pride of place is this bluestone. So it is a phenomenally important item, and its origin, I think, is safe to say, is still relatively contested, but it's down in all the books as being Boles Barrow bluestone. So we will certainly talk about that. Given everybody's ringing in from all around the world, I can say that, given the Maltese correspondent, I thought at least it's worth showing you a little bit of a map of where this particular monument lies. And it's in the area just to the northeast of Warminster, or I suppose the southeast of Westbury, and you have Andover to the east, and this big area here that you can see just to the right, really, of the X marks the spot, is the military training area. It's 38,000 hectares, or 94,000 acres, same size as the Isle of Wight, of the best archaeological landscape I think, in Western Europe. I'm going to say that, in Western Europe. There's so many elements to it, both from Neolithic, which we're going to talk about tonight, right through to monuments of the First and Second World Wars, which are of national importance. So we are truly blessed with the presence of the military, because it's preserved an awful lot of this wonderful archaeology. So I'm going to put up the military map. This is my daily map that I work with in the day job, and it's the same area at Salisbury Plain, with Warminster down the bottom left and the hill fort of Battlesbury. It's marked up for military training purposes. So this is the map that's issued to the military training teams, and when they go out in the exercises on Salisbury Plain, this is the map that we use. If they have to book in and give good references, this is one they'll refer to. And all the circles you can see are Neolithic long barrows. The biggest one in the middle underneath the Imber drop zone is Boles Barrow itself, but you will notice that there are a great deal of them all across the training area. You have various ones from Nook Barrow through to Gill Barrow up in on the right of the image. The rather wonderfully named Old Ditch Barrow, which is the furthest to the right that you can see. That's the one that gave me my job, because an element of the old ditch, the Bronze Age linear ditch that surrounds this particular monument was damaged on television, and we got a lot of stick for it, and they decided it'd be much cheaper to employ an archaeologist and pay for restitution of those sorts of things in the future. That was many years ago. But that's a particularly fine monument. It's 120 meters long. Sorry, go back. 120 meters long, the Old Ditch Barrow, making it the largest earthen long barrow, we think, in Britain. It's about 20 meters bigger than the West Kennet Barrow. A huge, great endeavour with Bronze Age ditch running from it. And it's a landscape feature. It's something that's been used for many, many years. The Bronze Age ditch makes use of it as a focal point. It becomes a parish boundary. It becomes the park boundary for the Tilbury arboretum. So it's something that's been used for many years. Barrows themselves are also intervisible in many occasions, and I think that's pretty significant. The Boles, the one we're looking at today, lying at the intersection of many of these tracks in the middle of the training area, is certainly one of the most impressive and best surviving monuments too. As with nearly all of the monuments on the training area, and indeed many throughout Wiltshire, it has been investigated in several occasions. The first iteration of this was by one of the most famous antiquaries that worked throughout Wiltshire, William Cunnington, who worked with people like Sir Richard Osgood, who put together his book, History of Ancient Wiltshire. And he was certainly one of the first investigators. And his initial interest in archaeology, I like the link in many ways with the project we've been working on called Operation Nightingale, which uses archaeology as a way of improving the well-being and status of military veterans, because his initial archaeology was in many ways for a medical purpose as well. It was because his doctor told him to ride out or die. So basically, get some exercise, go out and do stuff. And here's a picture of him with this a young female relative returning with an urn he's retrieved. Anyway, it's a purpose that he looked at, and Boles Barrow was one of those sites he looked at in 1801. The image lower right isn't in fact him at work on Boles Barrow, but it is him watching with, I think it's the Parkers family from Heytesbury who did all the actual physical work. And indeed, there's been some work by Paul Everall from the University of Winchester that suggests that the first documented use of an archaeological trowel, specifically used for archaeology, and indeed an archaeological knife, I've not seen one of those, was at this particular site, Boles Barrow, used by the Parkers. So the first investigations were by William Cunnington. And he found that there was a flint and sarsen cairn, and he refers to it as being like the rear of the house. He also said that the mound was 1.4 meters deep, made of chalk, and that there was a pavement of flint nodules on which there were a large number of human bodies and 7 oxen skulls. Well, the chalk mound, I mean, that's pretty common for the earthen long barrows that we've got on Salisbury Plain. These aren't the sort of big megalithic structures that you think of maybe when you think of long barrows, and the monuments like West Kennet or Wayland's Smithy, the Botswold 7 style of barrows, which have these huge stones on them. These are earthen long barrows, so they have an earthen mound, but flint platform is a pretty common thing as well. And I'll mention some more about a field later on, which is looking at them. But anyway, you'll see just even from those statistics there, this is maybe, even though it's an antiquary, above and beyond a lot of the archaeological research levels that took place in this particular time. So it's the real forerunners of British archaeology at the very start of the 19th century. And William Cunnington is eventually buried in Heytesbury. You can go and visit his grave in Heytesbury Church. So that's the plaque on the left on the outside of the church, and his grave is just outside on the other side of the wall in the graveyard. So he's a celebrated antiquary and someone who put together a lot of very important information that is definitely on display of his findings in devices, and it's really worth going to have a look and seeing some of the incredible discoveries that he and Parkers had made over 200 years ago. Next person to have a stab at this particular barrow, Boles Barrow, was again somebody else that reoccurs in many barrow excavations in Wiltshire, and this is Dr. John Thurnham. So he was much more interested in the human remains, which something that perhaps Cunnington wasn't quite so interested in. In fact, most of the human remains under Cunnington's regime, we think, were probably replaced within the barrow. And he looked at it in 1864. And you can see he found some of these reburied items, including 11 skeletons. And he removes some of these skulls from his particular collection. And he claimed that skulls had facial injuries. Now, that's really unusual because we're talking a barrow that is 5,500 years old. To get evidence of possible violence or conflict on these human remains would make it really rather extraordinary. Violence certainly took place in prehistory. There are enough documented examples of attacks on things like hill forts in the Iron Age. You go back into the later Bronze Age, you can't move the amount of weaponry that's been thrown into votive places. You think of Flag Fen, deliberately destroyed in many cases, but nonetheless, it's still a weapon. It may have been given as a gift to God, but its original design and purpose, in many cases, wasn't just for hunting. Things like swords, they are martial. Same with a lot of the shields. They may have a rationale is display, but again, they are backed, I think, by a military threat. And there are also lots of evidences in the later Bronze Age for bits of violence with human remains, with stab wounds, things like that. Even into the earlier Bronze Age, again, the Beaker period, you get flint arrowheads embedded. I think probably the best known one in Wiltshire, perhaps, is the Beaker period burial in the ditch at Stonehenge, which does have flint embedded, certainly in the rib cage, and there are other flint arrowheads nearby that may also have been part of that bit of violence. So not unknown in prehistory, but from a Neolithic perspective, sorry, that really is quite incredible. And you approach this maybe with a bit of a skeptical eye, thinking that this could be post-depositional damage, it could be overburden of the monument on top of the remains, it could be poor archaeological recovery. I'm not going to say it's going to be poor curation, David. I'm sure it wouldn't ever have been that. So you've got to be skeptical as to whether this is in fact violence, but nonetheless, it's certainly something that's worth approaching. And the next phase, and you can see this barrow has been gone over, was William Cunnington III. So this is grandson of the first William Cunnington in 1885 and 1886. And now got a photograph of him on the left. And this is where the real benefit of good archival storage and going through your archives and your museums really comes into play. And that's borne out by the research when we started putting this whole project together some while ago, actually. The thought about having a look at Boles Barrow again for various purposes. I had a word with David, and he and Lisa looking through what they might have. And David found this quite incredible scrapbook of elements connected with Boles Barrow and the excavation. So it's a curated element of various facts and discoveries and elements connected with past excavations of Boles Barrow, which were utterly sensational. And I think the thing that brought me over the most was, in fact, 2 photographs of the excavation of the 1880s. So just from the history of photography, these are pretty incredible items. Certainly from history of archaeological photography, very, very important. And there are 2 of them. I've shown the one that's best without sort of heightening it. There was another one with a horse and trap in it, but this one's really good because you can see one of the excavations looks like in progress, and I'm guessing at the eastern end of Boles Barrow, with individuals cresting the monument. There's a very healthy hoik into the side. And when they excavated it, they did say they dug it like half of a boiled egg. So they cut into it. So we were assuming a fairly large piece of work. And you can see, I think there's a chap with a top hat. One looks like he's sitting on a shooting stick on the edge of the trench, watching over people working away. So the chap sitting on the stick, watching, doing no work at all, looking at all the diggers' hard work. I can empathise with that role of the shooting stick man, and I'm sure my team would do. That's exactly what I do these days. Watching the excavation, doing very good for myself, or not myself, if I'm honest. So watching this photograph, I think is wonderful. That if nothing else in terms of fieldwork had been achieved, finding this discovery that David had made, really, really very important. And then our cup runneth over, because even more was present. Some very, very early documentation of the excavation itself. This is from the second Cunnington excavation. You can see a plan of the overall barrow with the flint area in the middle and what says a kist. All the red components are bits of bone. So there's lots of bits of human bone there. And he's even marked out the ditches of the barrow. Now, the ditches are very impressive on this barrow, as they are for many across Salisbury Plain. And I think that's one of the reasons is that we don't really have the rigors of deep industrial barrowing on Salisbury Plain. It was bought, first purchases of land on Salisbury Plain by the military from 1897. So they've stopped a lot of the deep tillage that might have affected other areas of Wiltshire, and therefore you can see these wonderful ditches, round barrows and long barrows still in situ. This plan is, again, very, very important. You can see a rudimentary sketch section, which at least has some heights to it. It says the barrow was 11 foot in height. It had 16 individuals in it, 4 more oxen, so there are more cattle. There seems to be quite a preponderance of cows in this particular monument. And then, crucially, what they say is a dark layer that had ammonia. So the material must indeed be blood, and that's a common description of excavations at this time period of the long barrows, the earthen long barrows, that there is this dark layer at the bottom. Usually it's interpreted as being blood, those inhumed within the monument. I think we probably assume these days that it is in fact the land surface, the Neolithic land surface, the very earth that is giving us this chocolatey brown light, but maybe more of that later. The other thing from a health and safety point of view, modern excavations, you see it's 11 foot, so that would definitely have implications for any excavation interventions that we intended to put together. So those are the early excavations. Now, the other item that was mentioned right at the start of the talk and on display in that Stonehenge exhibition was this bluestone. Cunnington, the first excavation in 1801, was the chap that located this. He refers to there being a lot of sarsen in the barrow, and in fact, there were lots of tumbles of sarsen stones, which is why he abandoned part of the excavation. But he does record, certainly in marginalia, a presence of a bluestone or a stone of the same type you get at Stonehenge, and he was a good geologist. So there's all this discussion about a potential bluestone being found away from Stonehenge and away from Preseli. Now, this is a key element in various discussions as to whether bluestones might be natural geological components or brought there glacially, or whether this one is abandoned. If you think about the phase of Stonehenge bluestones, it's far, far later than this stone been placed in the barrow from 3,700, give or take, BC. So it would be a very, very important element. Now, the bluestone itself was taken back to the house of Cunnington, which was in Heytesbury, as I've mentioned, where he erected, with a mixture of bluestones and sarsen stones from the barrow, a small henge in his own garden. I've not been able to trace this, but it's said to have come from there to the house of the local landowner. And the local landowner in Heytesbury House ended up being this chap on the left, Siegfried Sassoon, the very famous war poet. He's written lots of stuff about archaeology, in fact, of the area. He wrote a poem about Scratchwood Camp, which is an Iron Age fortification which has got a Neolithic enclosure. Used to be thought of as being a caustic enclosure. I think it's probably just an enclosure at the top and some barrows. So he imagines it from a Second World War perspective, what it might have been like in the past. And he's also written elements about the long barrows. So he was passionate about his archaeology, and having this bluestone was probably something he was quite keen on. The archival search has unearthed letters to and from Cunnington, and Colin Shell, another archaeologist, recalled buying a book on the archaeology of Wiltshire, which had a letter to Siegfried Sassoon from Cunnington asking if the bluestone, now on his land, could be sent to the museum in Salisbury because it was a really important thing. And again, it's another piece of, when word gets out you're doing this sort of field work, it's really lovely that it has all these wonderful tangents and little routes it takes you down to try and see where we go. So there's the letter. Cunnington talking about various bits and pieces and asking if the bluestone could go. Now, the bluestone that is in Salisbury Museum now, the one that was at Stonehenge exhibition, is pretty certainly, or pretty much without doubt, the one that was on the Heytesbury House estate. You can see here, and the Wiltshire Archaeological magazine here of this various elevations of the bluestone, and there's a photograph of it in situ at Sassoon's house in Heytesbury itself. That doesn't prove it's the same one that came from Cunnington's house, and that doesn't prove that's the same one that came from Boles Barrow. If it did. So the weight and size of the one that Cunnington records recovering from Boles Barrow are much smaller than this particular one that's down in Salisbury. So there you go again. That's the Salisbury Museum stone. I think you can think even with the images you can see there, I think we can fairly safely say it is the same stone. But whether or not it came from Boles Barrow, I think it's very difficult to say. Robbix has had a look at it. He's a famous petrologist, and he is certainly, he's absolutely certain it is spotted dolerite, so it's from Braccelli, maybe slightly different to some of the ones at Stonehenge, but nonetheless, it is a bluestone. That's as far as it goes. We certainly couldn't say that it's come from Boles Barrow. If you want to know more about the arguments of the origins of the Boles Barrow bluestone and whether or not it is indeed the same one as Salisbury, I certainly recommend this fabulous book by Mike Pitts. Mike is certainly of the opinion, I think most of us are now, that the Boles Barrow stone, there was indeed one from the Long Barrow, and the one in Salisbury are not one and the same. So have a look at that book. It goes into it in quite a bit of depth. Again, more archival elements before we even put a single spade into the ground. There is a concrete slab on the top of Boles Barrow, which is, again, it's amazing it survived in many ways because it's also in an artillery impact area. So a concrete slab on the top, which allegedly held a water tower at some point. There is a water tower to the west of the monument that's still there. It's not used anymore, but it is still there. But the one on the top of the barrow has gone. So we didn't know what it would look like, or indeed whether it was a water tower, until somebody pointed out that, in fact, there are images in Oxford University from Stuart Pigott, the chap that excavated the West Long Barrow, I'm sure you know, and also famously at Sutton Hoo. His archive had lots of pictures of early tanks rumbling around a Long Barrow and also having a water tower. And this is that water tower. And this is Boles Barrow. So we have now got a plan that Cunnington produced, an early photograph of the excavations of Cunnington. We've also got a picture or two by Pigott, and we're building up a real documentary archive of Boles Barrow and hopefully putting its biography together with nothing else. The human remains themselves are in devices. So I've managed to have the privilege of getting to look at these. You can see some of the photographs in the early excavation reports, and they certainly do look as though they've been given a bit of a bashing. One of them referred to having a sword cut to the atlas vertebra, the vertebra to the skeleton. Now, if you're thinking sword cut, blade wound, that's not going to be Neolithic because they didn't have swords in the Neolithic. Something that comes in the Bronze Age. It does have a sharp wound. We probably now suspect that this is one of those Saxon secondary inhumations in the Barrow. Again, a common phenomenon both in Neolithic and Bronze Age barrows. I think of just our experiences at Barrow Plum, where there are over 100 6th and 7th century burials in the Bronze Age burial mound. And Neolithic barrows are the same. There are good documented examples of these across Wiltshire, and there are some suggestions that this might be an execution site because this gap may have been dated. Here's an image from the scrapbook again, showing you the photograph of the mandible, which has got a vertebra interlinked at the top of the mandible, and the line drawing above it. And most of the reproductions, because of cost and the ability to reproduce imagery, were done in the line drawing stuff. But you can see it's a very good photograph, and the one at the above is in the Wiltshire magazine. The archives, again, from the things in the 1880s are fascinating because the human remains have been put back together. And it's, again, a history of how one curates remains and how one documents them. I suppose in many ways it's a bit of a dream because you've got all the documented material with it. So you can see it straight away. It's from Boles Barrow, the excavation of 1886. And it tells you there, large part of Calvarium, the upper part, bowl-shaped, has been cleft off and was perfect when found. And then it talks about it's been gnawed by rodents. So really very interesting. And most of these skulls have been back together. I'm sure there must be other bits of human remains recovered by Cunnington Jr. that are in other museums, and it wasn't uncommon at the time to have assemblage going elsewhere. I would imagine the Natural History Museum might be possible. I don't think there's any in Salisbury, but nonetheless, it's a useful set of human remains. And they were looked at again by a very good piece of work by Martin Smith, who's an osteologist at the University of Bournemouth now. And some of these results are published in his book, People of the Long Barrows, another very, very good book. the early Neolithic burials, and you'll probably recognise again the fact of John Thurnham on the front, and he does talk about the Boles Barrow burials in depth, and he studied them in quite a bit. Now, you remember my scepticism that these were potentially injuries. Well, these have been looked at by Martin, and he does suggest that, in fact, the initial assumption that they were certainly showing elements of displays of violence were correct. You can see there on the assessment, the minimum number of individuals, adults, two subadults, some have been mauled by canids and rodents, but skull fractures were there. 15 fragments from 8 individuals showed trauma, and wounds with a curved edge, possibly through an axe or something like that, with blunt force trauma. And that it wasn't just a male, so we're certainly not thinking it's simply a male thing, violence. I don't think anyone should do, but it's 4 males or probable males and 3 females or probable females amongst this assemblage. So Martin's work basically confirmed Thurnham's initial findings that these are some way other. These are combat victims or victims of violence. The dating for these was also really important because the radiocarbon sequence that he's come up with from these bones, and this was only done a few years ago, is between 3,800 3,650 calibrated BC. So it's more or less the sort of time period we'd expect it to be, but we've got some good fixes. This is a set of dates that haven't yet been published, and there's something we want to do as part of the overall drawing together of the evidence of Boles Barrow as and when we get to publish it. Dave Field, again, has looked at Barrows. He's a real expert that used to work for the Royal Commission of Historic Monuments and then English Heritage, then Historic England. And again, he thinks that in many ways that these earthen long barrows form parish markers they're almost like the fingernails of fingers of land at the tops of re-entrance, where one community could see another, and there are communal burial areas. Again, he talks about the buried land surfaces, and that some of these monuments may initially have had a socket for a standing stone put into them. The dead flint platform for the human remains, usually at the eastern end of the barrow. This is his plan, the Royal Commission's plan of Boles Barrow on the right of the image. And that's a really neat piece of work. So where do I come into it? Where does my team come into it? And the reason for doing this work, given it is a scheduled monument, it's one of only 27 earthen long barrows on Salisbury Plain, is down to these, the most dangerous individuals you find on Salisbury Plain. Forget the special forces, it's these fellas. Because, as I've always said, they are great at digging and rubbish at recording. And this was the reason that Boles Barrow was deemed to be heritage at risk. It wasn't because of artillery, it wasn't because of infantry, it wasn't because of tanks, it was because the monument was being burrowed into fairly substantially. And Boles Barrow was on heritage at risk, and the approach that we took at Boles Barrow was using it as one of the very early exemplars of a monument that was going to be meshed over. So the site would be badges removed, and you do this by putting a two-way cap flap on it. You run a cap flap, you get used to using that, and then you make it one way so they can get out but not back in again. And when you're sure there are no badgers living in the monument anymore, you cover the whole thing in mesh to keep them out. That's the theory. We started off by using a sort of a rabbit mesh to see if that would discourage them. It didn't particularly. So we then put it with chain link fencing, which certainly did discourage them. It ruins your geophysical signal, which is why we have no particular signal for the barrows. That was a lesson identified. And before we do any meshing, we make sure we get a geophysical survey done. And this particular monument has been chain linked. And what I wanted to do is to examine the efficacy and the shelf life of these particular barrows and meshing, just to make sure that this program being rolled out across Salisbury Plain was worth doing, or whether we should try and find new methodologies. This is one of the first, so this is over 15 years old. The shelf life of the mesh I was given was about 10 years, even though it's on free draining chalk. So I wanted to see how well this had lasted. So that was the reason I've been doing the field work and getting the scheduled monument clearance from Historic England to do it. So here's the monument as of spring this year. This is, you can see it's still a very substantial mound. The other thing you'll notice about it is the colour of the sky. I made a decision at university that I was a fair weather digger. Going going out in inclement weathers was really not for me, even though I was very keen on North European archaeology. So the chances were I would be facing bad weather. But nonetheless, I thought I'd restrict myself usually to summers. And at this time, the only time we could get in to do it with the training regimes was in the end of the financial year, this year in March. And even there, we were curtailed because the special forces decided they were going to need the area, and also they were going to train some Ukrainians. So clearly they had higher priorities than maybe an archaeologist on the training area. So this was a 1-week piece of work in March this year. If you remember March this year, the weather wasn't great.
Sorry, Richard, can I just stop you there for a moment? I'm afraid the audio is not holding up very well. Could I stop your sharing of the PowerPoint, and if I share the PowerPoint, but then you do the Chris Whitty next slide, please, and let's see if that will help. So it'll just take me a moment just to change that over. Sorry, can you just tell me what?
I can see that myself. I don't know. Can everyone else see it?
You can see the whole screen, not the edit mode. Is that right?
It's fine for me. I can see as much as I need to see.
Yeah. Okay. Interestingly, the audio still isn't great, but okay. Let's carry on.
Okay. So next slide, please. So the weather was really awful. You can see military figures walking through the landscape, and I mentioned invisibility of monuments. You should be able to see at least 2 more long barrows from this, but you really can't because the weather goes in. The infantry are walking past, and oh, is it gone? Can you still hear me?
Okay, Richard.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me again?
Yes, we can.
Good. Yeah, it's okay. So the infantry are walking past, and this is in the height of our fieldwork this spring. Next slide, please. Now, we assembled various experts on this site, and Julian, and this was to look at the various things we might find. So this is a sort of show and tell right at the start. The monolith on the table is a bluestone from Julian's collection. This is briefing the team on the sorts of things you might find. He's also got a lot of flints. And Julian worked with us throughout this piece of field work because he's hoping to put together a documentary on Stonehenge, which will be out at some point soon. Next slide, please. The first phase of the monument is to really get to grips of the mesh that covered the monument. And you'll notice you can't actually see the mesh, and that's one of the great things about it. The chalk grassland soon covers the protective measures, so you wouldn't notice that there is a protection all over this barrow, and it does keep the badgers out pretty successfully. But we wanted to see how well the mesh itself had lasted. So the first thing was to part this particular turf and get the mesh out of the way. Next slide, please. So here you go. We were given a permission for a 3-meter wide trench over a period of it's about 10 meters long, I think it was, going up to the top of the barrow. We wanted to see if we could intersect with some of the earlier excavations. We thought by doing this, we would encounter Cunnington's dig or Thurnham's dig. So we're peeling back the mesh on the right just to be able to expose the tops of the earlier archaeological elements. And one of the things we want to do, not just to see how well the mesh has survived, was to see if we could trace the previous fieldwork and maybe add to the section drawings or to a sample or any of the material that went back into it. So within actually the very first day, we established that the mesh was really well preserved. And that was great as a curator's point of view, because this meant that even though it'd been in the ground for a good decade and more, that it survived well. It was keeping the badgers out, so we knew we could roll this program out across the training area successfully. And it's a great thing. We don't have to keep going back and dealing with borrowing animals. You can do it as a one-off, and that will last for many years. So from the first point of view, that was great. So we established that that worked. Next place was to see if the archaeology was there. Next, please. One of the things we needed to do was to determine how much we could accomplish in the week that we were given. And the decision was made pretty quickly that we were allowed to do 3 meters wide. We would actually excavate it to the top of the mound, which is the like chalky area you can see on either side, and then lower the excavation to a deeper level in the second meter of the 3. So we were able to go down into a greater depth to see how well it was preserved, to see if we could pick up the work of Thurman and Cunnington, and just to see what other elements were still in situ. Next, please. The aerial view, I think, picks out quite nicely the extent of the barrow and how much we were intending to do about it. So it's a bit of a small slot, which is, we didn't need to do too much to it this particular season, and to try and get as much information from a small area. There's also some quite curious ripples. Just on the right of the image, you can see all the cars lined up on the edge of the track, and there's some ripples just to the left of it. And I'm still not entirely sure what those are geologically. I mean, I don't think they're periglacials, but any suggestions would be welcome on that. Next, please. We thought initially that this was the natural ground surface, the chalk. I think you can see in the foreground image, I think actually what you're looking at is a spread of material that is involved in reprofiling the long barrow as part of the meshing works, to fill in any badger holes, to make sure that the mesh will sit nicely on top of it. So there were some undulations and some holes left behind by the animals, and I think that chalk is simply a spread of locally sourced chalk to spread over the monument in the earlier part of the first century. Next, please. Again, it formed a good program for our wounded, injured, and sick military service personnel. This individual's from the Rifles, one of the local regiments, and it's his first go on it. He's actually quite interested in metal detecting, but on a Neolithic monument, probably not the best one for him to get involved in for that particular endeavour. But he's being taught about how to recognise particular flint flakes and flint tools that might be coming out of this particular monument by Tom from Essex Archaeology there. Next, please. I've just finished a piece of fieldwork in East Anglia, which was working for the American military, looking for potential human remains from a B-17 bomber crash in East Anglia. And that working directive was that we were to sieve every single bucket load of soil that came out from the excavation site in the measured grid squares that we were working on, just to see that we wouldn't miss anything osseous, no human bone. Well, we also, as part of our scheduled monument clearance on this particular one, we had to sieve everything that came out of the barrow. So the rocker sieves were extensively employed, in part to see if we were going to get any human remains that had been backfilled by Thurman and Cunnington, and in part also to see if there were any flint tools or any items from the Neolithic barrow itself. So it was a laborious process, but worked pretty well. Next, please. So there you go, going through the mesh and forcing everything through, and anything we thought might be bluestone, it might be sarsen stone, might be human bone, animal bone, or indeed any other finds. It was a lot of hard work, but I think it was a successful process. Next, please. So here we are. We assembled a crack team of flint experts. So you have Julian, as you probably recognise there, and then the orange high vis. I'm sure many of you also recognise Dr. Phil Harding, and they're having a flint off, discussing which flints were present and what they thought about the assemblage. And you can see the collection of some of the first ones found from this particular barrow in our fieldwork. As I said, we only worked here on this particular site for a week, and Phil Harding is going through the assessment process at the moment and he's reported back that already he's been able to identify over 3,000 Bronze Age flints from this 1 week of fieldwork. This is, I think he said it's later Bronze Age flint mapping. So somebody's been sitting and fabricating tools on top of the barrow in the later Bronze Age, which is a lovely part of the sequence that hasn't been picked up archaeologically before. Lots of piercers, a couple of scrapers. This is all something that will go to the report for the Wiltshire magazine later on. But a very rich late Bronze Age site, which was perhaps a bit of a surprise. Next, please. Also present, and although this is a lovely image, all these photographs are taken by a wonderful photographer, Harvey Mills, was the presence of military debris. You probably would expect this sort of thing. These are steak and kidney pudding tins, which have been eaten and put back into a foxhole or two on the barrow. I believe these are known as colloquially as babies' heads by some of the military who had them in the 1970s and 80s. We had a real collection of military debris. And also there was quite a neat hole, really nice straight-sided, and we were quite excited by what this might be. But right at the bottom was a marker pen. So this is a pen from probably the earlier 21st century, not something we encourage the military to do. And if nothing else, it also told me that meshing a monument against badgers is also a very good idea to mesh it against infantry and military figures. So normally they're very good, but this one we found evidence for military debris too. Part of the story, but not one we particularly wish to encourage. Next, please. Again, an image that shows you the later portion of the dig and just how inclement the weather was and how tricky getting to the site was, let alone excavating. It was horizontal rain pretty much all the time. Next, please. It was also cold, and we flew the site with drones. This is a drone used by the Training Safety Marshal, and he put the thermal imagery cameras on. And you can see all the little white figures there are the archaeologists, because they're the only warm things in the entire landscape of Salisbury Plain. Again, it was further to my excavation outside the summer in Wiltshire. Next, please. This is one of those drone shots. Jackie McKinley's in the orange jacket, I believe, there. And what we're looking at is on the left of the excavation trench, the chalk spread of the re-profile barrow. I think we're looking, the brown may be part of the ditch. And then on the right is chalk mound of the barrow. Next, please. And that's what really surprised us, is that we're in an area here that we are pretty convinced Cunnington and Thurnham probably examined, but we might be on the edges of it, because the barrow mound of chalk blocks haven't been disturbed in many places. So we're looking at pristine Neolithic long barrow in an area that's probably most archaeologically explored in Britain. And as such, it was an incredible eye-opener. Even though it's been badgered, it's been in an artillery area, it's been excavated 3 times, a large amount of this Neolithic barrow is still intact, and it makes you wonder what on earth else we might find were we to excavate it all, which is not our plan, but it'd be an incredible thing to do. And the white splodge you see in the section is chalk filling badger set, but just below it is a very, very dark layer. Next, please. And that dark layer is this supposedly ammonia-rich level, which we think is the very Neolithic land surface. So what you're looking at there is the base of the Neolithic barrow with its buried land surface. We've done a series of samples of this particular material, the dark material, that's gone off to be studied for soil micromorphology to see what we can tell about that particular Neolithic landscape. I'm afraid I don't have the results yet. It's quite a lengthy process that Wessex Archaeology have undertaken. But as soon as I have it, we'll let people know. But nonetheless, we have a Neolithic land surface and a chalk mound from 3,700, give or take, BC, which is absolutely mind-blowing given the location of this particular mound. Next, please. So there's Jackie telling me what she thinks is going on. We brought her there in case we found any elements of human remains. As you heard from earlier elements of the talk, there were lots of human burials that have been recovered here in past excavations. In fact, we didn't find any because we didn't, apart from that area I've showed you, get to the bottom of the barrow, and we didn't get to the area we think that had been disturbed by Cunnington or Furnham, and therefore going to have backfill elements of their major excavation sequences. So no human remains have been found by our project this year. So we are using the work by Martin Smith as part of our excavation attempts to draw that all together, and unless we find more in any future work. Next, please. And here we go. The difficulties of walking up and down the barrow to where behind the white buckets we have the intact chalk mound of Boles Barrow. Next, please. This is intact Neolithic burial mound, big chalk blocks. There's the old flint in it. It's largely big bits of chalk. We've done a very small sondage into that. It's almost like a metre square, dropping down and stopped at that particular level, just at about a meter's depth. So we know we've done a meter sample of complete solid chalk. We would have to go down, if you can recall, many more feet to get down to the bottom of the barrow, but this hasn't been disturbed. This isn't backfill of Cunnington and the others. So this is something we know it's there, it's pristine. Let's just leave it as it is. Next, please. So what finds did we get if we didn't get human remains? Well, I've mentioned to you we had a lot of flint, over 3,000 Bronze Age flints. Piercers and scrapers are the dominant tooled elements of the composition, but there are lots of struck flakes as well. Next, please. No bluestone. That's perhaps not a surprise to many people, but there are no elements of bluestone from this particular barrow in the elements that we've excavated. So we can't say one way or the other about the Salisbury Museum bluestone, or add any more to the discussions that are in Mike Pitts' book about Sassoon's bluestone, whether it is the one from Boles Barrow, indeed whether there was one from Boles Barrow at all. What we did have are large numbers of bits of sarsen stone. Something was picked up in previous excavations, but we can confirm that we are getting bits of sarsen stone in our excavation trenches too. So that is certainly true. Next slide. Animal teeth. I'm not an expert on these, so I'd like to say it's a tooth from a cow or oxen from the previous excavations, but I would be wrong in trying to be too definitive on that. But it's a possibility. So there were animal bones from it, and there were things like this echinoid. It could be a hammerstone, but it's probably a fossil. So we're getting bits and pieces from it, but from the prehistoric sequence, there was no prehistoric pottery that we encountered. Next. We did, however, get some Roman pottery, and I suppose that's the sort of thing you'd sort of expect to get Roman pottery across every site on Salisbury Plain, really. But we had some nice bowl rooms, if you like Roman pottery, then I said anyway, and one Roman coin as well. So there's evidence going back from some of the Neolithic things you've seen with the stonework, to the late Bronze Age, and now into the Roman period. Next, please. And then, apart from the military stuff, the latest thing was this these couple of clay pipe stems. Now, I like to think that these were possibly dropped by one of the workers, maybe one of the partners, when they were excavating at Boles Barrow, or one of the later excavators of the site. Is quite remote, and the military took over from 1897. So I think it's quite possibly the detritus of some of the early archaeologists on site. And I remember Josh Pollard excavating at Woodhenge and finding some of the cigarette wrappers of Maud Cunnington's excavation team. And I think it's the meta-archaeology of the monument itself and the history of archaeologists in many ways. So that's the most recent find we had, apart from the military elements as well. Next slide, please. So where does that leave us? I think what it does tell us is that this monument, even though it's been excavated by 3 or now 4 groups, is surprisingly well preserved. It was cut like a half of a boiled egg, apparently, and yet a lot of it still survives. A lot of the chalk mound is still there. So that's important. It also tells us that the protective measures that we put in place are working. I think there's a lot more archaeological data we could, should we wish, get from it. Now, I put the future ... because our permission was to put in 2 trenches. We had scheduled monument clearance for 2 trenches by Historic England, and because of the timing and the various military training and indeed the weather, we could only accomplish 1 of them, and that wasn't to a huge depth. My aspiration would still be potentially to do the 2nd trench that we wanted to do, which does follow that exact line of the second of the Cunnington excavations in the 1880s, and follow that line of their dig, maybe to get it to the bottom and record their section and see what data was put back in. That's something we'll have to see if the budgets are in place for. So could we tell anything about the bluestone? I think the answer, I'm afraid, is no. We haven't moved it any further forward, but nonetheless, I think we can safely say that this monument is pretty well preserved still, and certainly is still one of the most enigmatic in Wiltshire. Thank you.
Right, fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Perhaps you could put your video back on. So I turned it off to try and release some bandwidth. Someone has suggested you may actually have two microphones running at the same time, but
Really?
yeah, not sure how that would work, but
Rosie can't afford two. Yeah, the video doesn't seem to be starting. I don't know.
Okay, well that may well be me. So sorry, if you just bear with me a moment, I can. Yeah, you should be able to start it now. That's it, right? Never tried the remote control like that before, so there we go. So we've got a couple of comments in. Chris Sellen says the ripples you were talking about do look a bit man-made, like one half of a set of tracks. Hard to tell if any sort of weathering feature without knowing the slope angle.
Okay, that's interesting. They're quite severe. They're tricky to walk. I mean, it could be that it's been churned over by armored vehicles over many years. That's not an impossibility. Not an impossibility. They don't look like the periglacials that you do find across lots of the bits of Wiltshire.
Can I just ask Richard, if you lean back slightly, if your laptop, if the microphone on your laptop's sort of picking up your voice, that's possible. That could be what it is. And just to say, the slope angle, it's flat there, isn't it?
It's flat, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and so that's yeah. And someone has asked, why didn't you go deeper as the why didn't you go deeper?
Timings and health and safety is the brutal one. That one, we only had a certain amount of time, which is, and also, if we got any deeper, we'd have to start shoring. That would have been quite tricky, I think, to do. So that may be something we can do if we do another season, and I would like to go deeper if we can. It's all dependent on time and cost, really.
Yeah. And having had the pleasure of visiting, I have to say it was just bitterly cold. So
it was altogether unpleasant, let's be honest.
Not ideal excavation conditions, shall we say?
No.
So Alan has said, first, huge kudos for the wonderful work of Nightingale. Second, is Boles Barrow on a possible transit route for the bluestones across the plain after a journey from the Bristol Avon / Wiley, assuming a crossing of the channel?
So that's certainly one of the things that has been postulated. If there was a bluestone in there, so let's say, for argument's sake, there was a bluestone in there, and Clayton may well have been right on that. He was a geologist, as I said. So it would be, if you drew a line, there's no reason why you couldn't go from the Wiley across Salisbury Plain. But then you're into those arguments of how they move these stones anyway, aren't you? With rollers or whatever. I think we still haven't got that one out either. But it's not impossible. The thing is, if it's come from that particular quarry over in whether it be Warnmorn or wherever over in Wales, and particularly over to Stonehenge, what's it doing there for hundreds of years before the bluestones are erected at Stonehenge? We are talking hundreds of years between Boles Barrow being erected and built and closed, and then the stone circle Stonehenge. So what's it doing there?
Yeah, and well, if we just stick with that for a moment, of course, there's also a suggestion from Mike Parker Pearson that there's a gap between the quarry site at whichever one it is, the one down in the valley. I can never remember the names of them. Sort of a 200-400 year gap between the quarry site and the stones appearing at Stonehenge.
Yeah,
which is interesting. David has said, where did the flint come from? In brackets, he's obviously rather hoping it's Norfolk.
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid I can give you no answer at all on that one. I haven't declared. That's something that Phil will be looking at. Phil Harding's putting the report together, so hopefully he might be able to elucidate on that one. He'll be hoping for good Wiltshire flint, but I really couldn't tell you. Yeah, Norfolk flint would be nice, wouldn't it?
It would, wouldn't it? Sorry, and Simon's reminded me it's Craig Rossi Fallin. I should have remembered that.
Thank you, Simon. I hope Simon noticed himself in the slide as well.
And Janine and Carlos have said, if another season was okayed, would you also plan to excavate some of the flanking ditch?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought to, because I'm really wanting to follow the Cunnington dig one. I don't think he did a huge amount on that, but it might not be impossible. It would depend on cost, wouldn't it, really? And yeah, it might not be. You could get some stuff in there. I think you get a lot of military debris if you did that, but it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea.
Sorry, that's made me think of something, because if you look at Adam's grave, which of course was excavated by Thurnham,
yeah,
you can see where his spoil tip was, and on the contour survey, the Hasher survey, there are a couple of lines on the southern ditch. Could that be his spoil?
It could be. There's some real anomalies on that Hasher survey. You're right, and we've always interpreted one as being a causeway on the northern boundary as a causeway put in by the military to go up to that water tower.
Okay.
But it may not be. That. It may not be. That's what we've interpreted it as. But it may not be. May not be. So that might answer some questions.
So I wouldn't mind having a crack at the spoil tip at Adam's grave, but that's another story.
Yeah. There's so much work to do, David.
Well, for someone to do. And David has asked, is there evidence that the barrows were robbed during the Roman period?
Not that we've found. No. There is a little bit of Roman we've seen, and certainly in the excavation that we did, there's no evidence of any disturbance other than that 3rd century and by quadrupeds. Other than that, no, we've not seen any. But that's not to say it didn't happen. It happened in some of the other barrows, and certainly on the brown barrows we've been looking at places like Barrow Clump. Most of the barrows had been denuded by the Roman period, often by Roman power. Actually, they've got rid of a lot of them.
Okay, well that's it for questions, unless there's a last one. No, nothing by the sound of it. Okay, well, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating, and great to hear all about the excavations. And as I say, having visited it and been frozen to the bone in the sort of half an hour I was on site, I don't know how you and everyone else on the team managed to deal with it for the right length of time. Of course, you don't. Of course, the saying is it's inadequate clothing.
Yes, there is that, and they also tell you that skin is waterproof, but that's not very comforting at 2 degrees. There we are.
So could I just say a huge thank you for what's an absolutely fascinating project, and it's going to be really interesting to hear more about post-X and the blood layer. I love the idea of the ammonia. Really looking forward to hearing about that.
Super, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Reminder that I think it's on Monday, I'm going to be looking at some recent acquisitions to the museum. That's a free talk for our members. That's Monday evening, so do remember you can book in for that. Okay, with that, a big thank you to everyone for coming. A huge thank you to Richard, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you. Bye, everyone.